Hi folks, it's Jim Butler, and today I thought I'd tell you some things that perhaps you didn't know about Beaumont LEYS. So where do I mean when I say Beaumont LEYS? For me, Beaumont LEYS is that ridge of high land directly northwest of the city centre, including Moat Hill, Stocking Farm, Home Farm, Anstey Heights and even the Stadium Estate. But where does the name Beaumont LEYS come from? Well, the second part, the LEYS element, is quite straightforward. In Old English, a ley or leys are a clearing in a forest, and we know that this area was most definitely on the edge of both the Charnwood Forest and the Leicester Forest, so quite clearly a clearing within that area is where we get the LEYS element. The Beaumont bit is not quite as straightforward. We know that from the 12th century for 100 years, this area of land is pretty much owned by the de Bowmont family, the first Earls of Leicester. So perhaps this means the clearing that is owned by the de Bowmont family. However, in Norman French, the word Beaumont, Beau and Mont, means beautiful hill. And there's no denying that once you're up here, this is quite the beautiful hill. So perhaps the term is more geographical in nature. Perhaps we'll never know. From the 12th century, the area we now know as the Stadium Estate was actually a deer park owned by the monks of Leicester Abbey. In 1385 we get our first reference to St John's Stone, the last remnant of a 5,000-year-old stone circle, perhaps reminiscent of that of Avebury or Stonehenge. Sadly, the stone becomes eroded over time, although by 1815 John Flowers does a great drawing of it, showing it still to be quite some height. Sadly, all that's left is a small remnant which resides in one of these gardens on Somerset Avenue. But by the 13th century, this area to the west of Beaumont LEYS that we now call Castle Hill is a mosaic of oakland, heath and pasture, pretty much like today still. And it's used for timber, for grazing and for recreation. But around 1260, the 6th Earl of Leicester, Simon de Montfort, grants the land to the Crusading Order of the Knights of the Hospital of St John of Jerusalem, also known as the Knights Hospitaller. Founded in the early 12th century after the First Crusade, the Knights Hospitaller had taken an oath to defend Jerusalem and to care for the injured and sick pilgrims on their way to and from the Holy Land. To do this, they needed money, and most of that money came from properties around England. What was built here at Castle Hill would become one of those properties. Thanks to the recent excavations by the University of Leicester's Archaeological Services and the local Beaumont LEYS community, we now know that this site was most probably used as a sheep farm by the Order in order to fund its activities in the Holy Lands. It contained a large house with over almost 1,000 acres of arable land, meadow, pasture and an apple orchard. At some point a huge fish pond was added, but in 1306 the Master of BEAUMONT got in trouble with the town burgesses in Leicester for illegally selling wool from the site in the town. Shocking. But by the 15th century the site is in decline, perhaps due to local competition from the Knights Templar, who had their own preceptory just the other side of the ridge over there in Rothley. In 1482 the Order comes to an agreement with King Edward IV, swapping the land here for a more profitable preceptory in Lincolnshire. Edward IV then absorbs it back into Leicester Forest as part of his own personal hunting grounds. Nice. So why is the area called Castle Hill, you might ask? Well, in the 19th century, a local historian saw the earthworks and thought that they were perhaps part of an Iron Age hill fort, and it's thought the name derived from that misinterpretation. However, when the archaeologists were here just a few years ago, they looked for any signs of an Iron Age hill fort and sadly found nothing. Everything that was here was pretty much 13th and 14th century, proving that it's medieval. I don't know, can't trust these local historians, can you? In the late 16th century, Queen Elizabeth I granted the manor of Beaumont LEYS and all its lands to Sir Henry Skipworth. Sir Henry Skipworth then divided the whole area into several pieces of arable and pastoral farms and sold them off to the gentry. The red checker brick building behind me, known as Home Farm or Beaumont LEYS House, is thought to have first been built around the late 16th century, And in 1714, it was home of the government MP John Isleby, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Wow! The Georgian building behind me is Stocking Farm. And Stocking Farm is one of those original estates which is sold off by Queen Elizabeth I. It would eventually become part of the City Farms network and is today a community centre which serves the local population. But long before the Stocking Farm estate was here, there was another neighbouring area called Stocking Wood, which stood sort of in the area behind me there. The 18th century historian John Nichols comments that within Stocking Wood there is a rare wild flower which grows. Sadly, during the Napoleonic Wars of 1793 to 1805, timber was needed to help grow the fleet that would fight Napoleon. So the huge oaks from Stocking Wood were felled and sent to become part of these huge wooden ships that we now know today. Who knows, perhaps there's even a bit of Stocking Wood inside HMS Victory. How cool would that be? During the Victorian period, Leicester's population exploded, growing so quick that actually the sanitation systems weren't in place to cope with it. So although houses were being built, they had open cesspits and sewage was running down the streets. By 1887, Leicester had a higher infant mortality rate than Manchester and London. That's how many children were dying because of cholera and other water-based diseases. Something had to be done. Something had to be done quickly. And that something was the building of a new sewage system and, importantly, the Abbey pumping station behind me. The role of the pumping station was simple. All of the sewage from the town would flow down through the new sewage system to the lowest point in the town, here by Corporation Road. It would then be at the pumping station where the massive 4 beam engines would pump all that sewage over a mile away and up to the height of that chimney to Beaumont LEYS. The town council knew it needed somewhere where it could dispose of all the sewage from the city. And so in the 1880s and 1890s, it spent huge amounts of cash buying up the entire estate of Beaumont LEYS. The idea was to create a huge sewage farm where the sewage from Abbey pumping station could be pumped up, it could settle on the surface of the land, all of the liquids could filter through the natural geology down back into the water source and be purified, whereas all the solids could then be kept, scooped up and sold as manure to local farmers around the county. This is exactly what happened in that whole area that's now under Beaumont LEYS shopping centre, under the Walker's factory, and the whole expanse of Beaumont Park is where that sewage farm was. And quite frankly, it saved the city from itself. Now, believe it or not, but Moat Hill hasn't always been the quiet, leafy suburb that you might imagine. In fact, there are 2 historical events that are both recorded as the Battle of Moat Hill. The first happened in 1842, when Chartists, workers who were wanting equal rights and equal votes, led a procession from Leicester heading to Loughborough. But when they got here to Thurkeston Road at Moat Hill, the police barred their way, and what ensued was a short scuffle in which apparently a gunshot was fired and a local water pump was damaged. Shocking stuff. The more hazardous Battle of Moat Hill happened about 50 years later in the 1890s, when the Great Central Railway was being built past Thurkeston Road towards Birstall. The navvies who were working on the railway would often go to the pub and get riotously drunk. On one occasion, the English and the Irish navvies decided to gang up on the Scottish ones and make fun of them because they didn't yet celebrate Christmas. It wouldn't become a national holiday until the 1950s in Scotland. What happened then was a huge brawl on the road between them all, and the police were soon called to see what was going on. But rather than stop the battle, the police stood back, watched it all unfold, and decided to wait until they'd all exhausted themselves. That was the end of the Battle of Moat Hill. During the 1950s and 60s, Leicester City Council started to build new estates at Moat Hill, Beaumont, LEYS and Stocking Farm. They built over 1,000 houses in order to rehome all those people that were still living in the Victorian slums of Leicester around the Wharf Street area and the Belgrave Road area, which was due for demolition. Soon, Beaumont LEYS was home to not only the people who had lived in those slums in Leicester, but also new migrants. People like Mari Wright from London and Paddy Butler from Southern Ireland, who would come and settle on this road, Bedale Drive in Beaumont LEYS. And soon they would be joined by my dad Jimmy, my uncle Sean, my auntie Kathleen, my uncle David and my auntie Maria. And like many other families here, this was home. To think about it, without Beaumont LEYS, I wouldn't be here. People have called Beaumont LEYS home for over 700 years. And at the moment, it's perhaps at its most vibrant and diverse that it ever was. But next time you pass through, either on the ring road or stop off at the shopping centre, have a think about the medieval knights of Castle Hill that were once nearby, or all those grand gentry types who lived on the farms after it was changed from the hunting park. Or just think about the families that settled here from the 50s and 60s onwards, families like my family who still call Beaumont LEYS home. Thanks for watching and I hope to see you again soon. Cheers.
Up the boys, Beaumont LEYS, happy pumping station.
Nice one.